believe that some Somali people living there in Minneapolis could get away with defrauding the state for, say, $9-10 billion a year?
No. My answer would be no. I don't think they could be doing that without help from the deep state.
Of course not. Washington, D.C. is totally involved in this and not only allowed it to happen, but made it happen. So that's because Israel recently recognized Somaliland, part of Somalia, as an independent state. Why would Israel do so? Well, they need a place to deport the Palestinians to. But you don't just get a piece of land where you can deport 2 million people to. You have to pay for it. And that's what this is. The U.S. is the greatest ally of Israel. Remember, the United States citizens, middle-class people, taxpayers, are going to pay for that. This whole scam, the Somali care system scam, whatever, to me looks like an annual rental agreement where the U.S. taxpayer is now forced to pay $10 billion a year to the Somali elites, to Al-Shabaab, the terrorist organization, and so on, in exchange for a piece of land where Israel can then deport the Palestinians to. Your whole government is corrupt, okay? And this is just Somalia. Imagine what the USA is doing with India. Imagine how much money you're bleeding to India.
So that comes from this guy, Johannes M. Cohenbrett, and he wrote a Substack called, "Is the FBI investigating or organizing the Somali fraud?" Well, here's what he said. "I find it hard to believe that Somalia could pull this off on their own where no one else could. How come Mexicans or Puerto Ricans never could do this? Are Somalis with their average IQ below 70 such law-tech geniuses that only they could pull off such a massive fraud and apparently get away with it fairly undetected ever since Obama sent Somalis to Minnesota in 2014? At the same time, as I said, Israel recently became the first country worldwide to recognize Somaliland, a breakaway region of the northwest of Somalia, as a sovereign nation. This raised my suspicion. Why would Israel care to recognize some breakaway region as a sovereign nation? Well, for starters, Somaliland is close to the Gulf of Aden, the entry point into the Red Sea, which leads up to the Suez Canal. This gulf is one of the crucial linchpins supplying the West with international trade coming out of India and China overseas. Apparently funded by the United Arab Emirates, Israel is already building military bases in Somaliland. The U.S. has bases in neighboring Djibouti. The location near the Gulf of Aden appears only extra crucial vis-a-vis the incessant attacks coming out of Yemen across the Gulf, where the Houthi rebels have been using Iranian or even Chinese-backed drone systems to attack the U.S. Navy's, Israel's, and NATO's vessels. The cheap rebel drones have been wreaking a ton of havoc and have also made the West lose some face, since its super advanced systems are no match against the primitive sticks and stones being thrown at it. But one does not simply acquire a piece of land the size of a country, not without war or without bribery. To secure Somaliland in the ever-complexifying geopolitical struggle for Western dominance, Israel and its greatest ally, the USA, if not Britain, would have to have offered the Somali elites something of value. And that's how I made the connection to the Somali fraud cases in Minnesota. Wait, did Obama really send Somalis to Minnesota in 2014? Yes, he did. The problem was neither the USA nor Israel could be seen bribing Somali elites to give up Somaliland. So I think the whole migration of people to Minnesota served as a payment scheme, perhaps a rental scheme. The people who would later commit massive fraud against U.S. authorities were being shipped in under Obama, but this doesn't let Trump off the hook. Trump, the narcissist, is more concerned about winning his Nobel Peace Prize, which Israel's Netanyahu personally promised him to get. Trump seems controlled by Israeli interests, you'd think. What I find hilarious, though, is that the U.S. ruling circles chose to do a fraud scheme to the benefit of terrorist organizations such as Al-Shabaab in Somalia? Why didn't they just give the Somali leaders some theme parks, landmarks, or skyscrapers? I guess that too much of U.S. real estate has already been promised to Arabs, Russians, and Chinese investors. They're running out of options to bribe foreign partners unless they start taking the money directly out of the social services coffers. Yes, in short, I believe the Somalis that Obama brought in were henchmen. And I believe these henchmen were given free rein by both Washington, D.C. and the FBI to commit fraud. And no, I don't think the FBI Director, Kash Patel, is going to do anything about it because the FBI isn't investigating the fraud. The FBI is organizing it. So that's that guy's theory. Now, I can't vouch for the veracity of his theory or any of these theories. But it certainly is interesting. There's definitely a connection between the fraud of Somalian people in Minnesota with Israel recognizing Somaliland and wanting to get the Palestinians to Somalia. There's definitely a connection. There's definitely a connection. Okay, so I mean, everybody has seen Nick Shirley's reporting on the unbelievable fraud happening through daycare centers and Somalians in Minnesota. It's got over 100 million views on his report, and he's been boosted by everybody. And James Lee is here to tell you there's another side to this story about Nick Shirley, and let's listen.
So it turns out one of the most viral stories of 2025 about the Somali daycare fraud in Minnesota ends up being a complete psyop. Because evidently, Israeli reporters are now asserting that Mossad and Israeli intelligence, not U.S. authorities, were responsible for exposing the Somalian-ran Minnesota fraud operations.
How is Israeli Mossad related to the recent corruption that was discovered in Minnesota? You're not going to believe it, but there actually is a substantial connection, and it runs through the Israeli Prime Minister office. Let's start from the end. Israel just established relationships with Somalia, which is not Somalia.
And what does that mean? Let's take a listen.
Does anyone know what Somaliland is, really? Said U.S. President Donald Trump after Israel became the first country in the world to recognize the self-proclaimed republic in Eastern Africa. Somaliland is a small territory in the Horn of Africa that broke off from Somalia in 1991. So why does Somaliland even matter? It sits in the Gulf of Aden, one of the world's most important shipports. There's also a Gaza-related angle. Earlier this year, it was reported that the U.S. and Israel have explored Somaliland as a potential destination for displaced Palestinians from Gaza.
And bingo, that is why we've been hearing so much about Somalian fraud in Minnesota. Because it had already been reported weeks before by the U.S. attorney that fraud in Minnesota exceeded $9 billion. $9 billion, that's a whole lot of fraud compared to, what was it? Nick Shirley talked about $110 million, $9 billion. We're talking about a small fraction, but focusing specifically on the Somali community. And then you have the amplification of this story, which isn't necessarily organic, right? You have people like Elon Musk, Vice President J.D. Vance, Attorney General Pam Bondi, all amplifying this story. I'm not discounting that the fraud exists within the Somali community, but is the focus, is the amplification making us feel a certain way, or trying to make us feel a certain way about the Somali community? That's the question. Now, according to Somali intelligence, Somaliland has accepted 3 Israeli conditions in exchange for Israeli recognition. One is the resettlement of Palestinians. 2, the establishment of an Israeli military base on the coast of the Gulf of Aden. And Somaliland joining the Abraham Accords. Well, isn't that a lovely and convenient development for the state of Israel? That they get somewhere to dump the Palestinians. They also gain a critical and strategic military base, and they create an ally in the region that did not exist before. So maybe they get a resident independent journalist who maybe isn't so independent if you read what this story is all about.
Well,
to do a story that says Somalians bad.
well, it certainly seems fishy. And James is on it, and as we reported in the other video, that the Somaliland is real. All those things are really happening. And I think if you take the Nick Shirley story at face value, you are doing exactly what they want you to do. But again, this story was has been reported several times about this daycare scandal. It was reported as far back as 2013. But it was also reported